The biggest mistake I see every summer is people trying to save their spinach by giving it more water when the heat arrives. I used to do exactly the same thing, and every year I watched those beautiful green leaves turn bitter, stretch upward, and disappear almost overnight. It feels frustrating because you think you are helping the plant, but without realizing it, you are actually pushing it closer to the end of its life. If your spinach suddenly starts growing tall instead of producing leaves, if the harvest gets smaller every week, or if the leaves lose that fresh, sweet taste you enjoyed just days before, there is a very good chance that the heat is not your biggest enemy. The real problem is the way most of us react to that heat. I learned this lesson many years ago from an older gardener who smiled when he saw me carrying bucket after bucket of water to my spinach bed. He told me that spinach does not ask for more water first. It asks for protection. At the time, I did not fully understand what he meant, but after trying his simple method, I never looked at summer gardening the same way again. Since then, I have kept harvesting spinach long after many of my neighbors believed the season was already over. It did not require expensive products or complicated equipment. Everything I needed was already around my garden, and once I understood how to use those simple things, the plants stayed healthier, the leaves remained tender for much longer, and I spent less time worrying every time the weather forecast announced another heat wave. That is exactly what I want to share with you today because I know how disappointing it is to see a healthy crop disappear just when you were hoping for one more good harvest. By the end of this video, you will know why most spinach fails during hot weather, what simple change makes the biggest difference, and how an old method that many gardeners have forgotten can keep your plants producing when others have already given up. And before we get to that first simple change, there is one mistake almost everyone makes that quietly speeds up the entire process without even noticing it. Most people never notice that spinach begins losing the battle against heat long before the leaves actually wilt. I certainly did not notice it for years because the plants still looked green enough from a distance, and I believed everything was fine. Then, one afternoon, I would walk into the garden expecting another basket full of fresh leaves, and instead I would find plants that had changed almost overnight. The leaves became smaller. The stems stretched higher. The flavor turned stronger and slightly bitter. That is when I realized the damage had already started several days earlier. Heat does not simply dry spinach out. It tells the plant that its growing season is ending, and that it should stop making tender leaves and start preparing seeds instead. That is why adding more and more water rarely solves the real problem. The roots may become wetter, but the plant still believes its time is running out. An older gardener explained it to me in the simplest way possible. He said, "Never fight the sun with water alone, because water cannot convince spinach that spring has returned. You have to make the whole plant feel cooler and safer. Very few people do this because they think it requires expensive shade cloths or special garden structures. The truth is much simpler than that. I have used old wooden stakes with a piece of light fabric. I have even used an old white bed sheet that was no longer good enough for the house. The goal was never to hide the spinach from the sun all day. The goal was only to soften those hottest afternoon hours when the leaves suffer the most. The first time I tried this forgotten method, I expected only a small improvement, but after several days I noticed something surprising. The leaves stayed wider. They remained softer to the touch. The plants slowed down their rush to produce flower stalks, and I continued harvesting while nearby gardens had already lost most of their crop. That single change also meant I used less water because the soil stayed moist much longer. It saved time, saved money, and gave me a harvest that lasted well beyond what I thought was possible. But there is another mistake that quietly works against this method, and most gardeners make it every single morning without giving it a second thought. That small habit can undo everything you have done to protect your spinach, and that is exactly what I want to show you next. The next lesson took me much longer to learn because it looked too ordinary to matter. I used to water my spinach early every morning because everyone said morning watering was the safest choice. I believed I was doing everything right, yet my plants still struggled whenever the weather stayed hot for several days. Then, one summer, an old neighbor watched me finish watering before breakfast and quietly asked me one question. He said, "Have you ever checked how warm the soil becomes by noon after you water it?" I'd never even thought about it. Later that day, I pushed my hand into the ground and I was surprised by what I felt. The surface had already become hot while the moisture deeper down was still trapped below. The spinach roots were living between two completely different conditions. From that day forward, I stopped watering just because the clock said it was morning. Instead, I started paying attention to the soil itself. I would gently move aside the top layer with my fingers and check the moisture a couple of inches below the surface. If it was still cool and damp, I waited another day, even if the weather forecast promised high temperatures. Most people make the mistake here because they water on a schedule instead of listening to the garden. Too much watering keeps the surface soft, but often encourages shallow roots that suffer even faster once the afternoon heat arrives. The older gardener showed me another forgotten habit that cost absolutely nothing. He covered the soil around the spinach with a light layer of dry grass clippings that had already dried in the sun for a day or two. Sometimes he used shredded leaves from the previous autumn. There was nothing fancy about it. The layer was thin enough for air to move through, but thick enough to keep the soil from baking under direct sunlight. I copied his method, and within a week I noticed that the ground stayed cooler for much longer. I was watering less often, and the spinach looked stronger even during the hottest afternoons. The leaves remained crisp and the plants kept producing instead of racing toward flowers. That simple covering became one of the easiest ways to protect the harvest without spending a single dollar. But there is one more overlooked detail that can either help this method work beautifully or ruin it completely. It is something many gardeners remove without realizing they are taking away one of the spinach plant's greatest protections, and once you understand why, you will probably never do it the same way again. One habit changed everything for me, and the funny part is that it looked almost too simple to make any difference. I stopped trying to make every spinach bed look perfectly clean. For years, I believed removing every extra leaf and every little piece of natural cover made the garden healthier. It certainly looked neat, but my spinach paid the price every time the weather turned hot. The soil dried faster. The roots became warmer. The plants hurried toward bolting even when I thought I was taking good care of them. Then an older gardener showed me something I had been throwing away without thinking. After every harvest, he left a few of the older outer leaves resting gently on the soil instead of carrying everything to the compost pile. At first I thought he was simply being lazy, but he smiled and told me those old leaves were still working even after they had been picked. They shaded the ground, slowed evaporation, and gradually returned moisture and nutrients back into the top layer of soil. I decided to try exactly the same approach, and within days I noticed that the earth underneath stayed noticeably cooler. Very few people do this because they want every bed to look perfect. But spinach does not care how tidy the garden looks. It only cares about stable conditions around its roots. That is why I also stopped harvesting the entire plant at once. Instead, I picked only the larger outer leaves and allowed the smaller center leaves to continue growing. Most gardeners make the mistake here because they think taking everything at once saves time. It does save a few minutes today, but it often shortens the entire harvest. By leaving the center untouched, the plant keeps producing fresh leaves instead of feeling that its growing season is ending. This old harvesting method was shown to me many years ago, and it has never failed me during difficult summers. I return every few days, collect another handful of leaves, and leave the plant strong enough to keep growing. It feels slower at first, but over several weeks the total harvest becomes much larger than cutting everything in one visit. The best part is that this method costs absolutely nothing and can be started today with the spinach already growing in your garden. Still, there is another small detail that most people completely overlook, and once I discovered it, I realized why some spinach stays fresh through the hottest weeks, while other plants standing only a few feet away seem to give up far too early. The next lesson came after one of the hottest summers I can remember. I thought I had finally figured everything out because my spinach was shaded, the soil stayed cooler, and I was harvesting only the outer leaves. Then another stretch of hot weather arrived, and I noticed the plants beginning to slow down again. They were still alive, but something had changed. That was when I remembered another piece of advice an older gardener had shared with me years before. He said, never let spinach fight the heat alone. At first I thought he meant adding fertilizer, but that was not what he meant at all. He showed me how he always planted taller vegetables where they could give spinach a little afternoon protection. Sometimes it was beans growing on simple stakes. Sometimes it was tomatoes placed far enough away that they did not compete for space but still cast a little shade when the sun became strongest. It was never about blocking all the sunlight because spinach still needs light to grow well. It was only about taking away the hardest hours of the afternoon. Very few people pay attention to where the shadow falls during the hottest part of the day. Most gardeners only think about the morning sun, but afternoon heat is usually what pushes spinach toward bolting. I started watching my own garden more carefully instead of planting everything in straight rows without thinking. I noticed that moving spinach just a few feet to a place where it received gentle morning sun and light afternoon shade made a remarkable difference. The leaves stayed softer, the soil dried much more slowly, and I continued picking fresh spinach long after I expected the season to end. Another mistake I used to make was feeding the plants too heavily once they looked tired. I believed more fertilizer would solve the problem, but all it did was create quick, soft growth that suffered even faster in extreme heat. The older method was much simpler. Healthy soil prepared earlier in the season and steady care were far more valuable than trying to rescue stressed plants with extra feeding. Sometimes doing less really produced better results. Looking back now, I realize that every small change worked together instead of acting alone. Shade protected the leaves. Mulch protected the roots. Careful harvesting encouraged new growth. Smart placement reduced heat stress. None of these methods cost much, and most cost nothing at all. Yet there is one final habit that ties all of them together, and once I made that change, my spinach harvest became far more dependable even during summers that many gardeners considered impossible. Looking back now, I can honestly say that saving spinach during extreme heat has very little to do with luck and almost everything to do with paying attention before the plants begin asking for help. That was probably the hardest lesson for me, because I always waited until I saw wilted leaves before doing something. By then, the spinach had already spent several days under stress, and it needed much more time to recover. Now I watch for the small signs instead. I notice how quickly the soil dries after sunrise. I look at the color of the leaves. I pay attention to how fast new growth appears in the center of the plant. These little details tell me much more than waiting for a serious problem. Very few people make these simple observations because they believe successful gardening depends on expensive products or special knowledge. In my experience, it depends much more on spending a few quiet minutes with the plants every day. That habit has saved me more harvests than any fertilizer or garden tool I have ever bought. Another forgotten method I still use is harvesting during the coolest part of the morning. The leaves are full of moisture, they stay fresh much longer after picking, and the plant experiences far less stress than if I harvest during the hottest hours of the afternoon. It may seem like a small difference, but over an entire season, those small differences continue adding up. I also resist the temptation to remove every leaf that looks slightly older. As long as a leaf is healthy, it continues protecting the plant by producing energy and giving a little extra shade. Most gardeners make the mistake here because they want every plant to look perfect all the time. I have learned that healthy spinach is far more important than perfect-looking spinach. Some leaves will never appear in a gardening magazine, and that is perfectly fine if the plant continues feeding my family week after week. Every summer reminds me that nature rewards patience more than speed. Simple habits repeated regularly almost always outperform complicated solutions used only once. When I combine gentle afternoon shade, careful watering, light mulch, steady harvesting, and daily observation, My spinach stays productive much longer than I ever believed possible. But there is one final idea that changed the way I think about gardening completely, and it has very little to do with spinach itself. Once I understood that lesson, every season became calmer, easier, and far more rewarding than all the years I spent fighting against the weather. When I think back to all the summers I spent worrying about my spinach, I realize the biggest change was not something I added to the garden. It was something I stopped doing. I stopped fighting nature and started working with it instead. Once I accepted that spinach simply needs a little help during the hottest weeks rather than completely different treatment, everything became easier. I no longer wasted water trying to solve every problem. I no longer believed expensive products were the answer. Instead, I trusted a few simple methods that had already helped gardeners for generations. A little afternoon shade, soil covered with natural mulch, careful watering only when the soil truly needed it, harvesting the outer leaves while allowing the center to keep growing, watching the plants every day before problems became serious. None of these ideas are difficult. None of them require special equipment. Yet together they can completely change the way your spinach performs during a hot summer. I still feel a quiet sense of satisfaction every time I walk into the garden and see healthy green leaves, while many people believe the spinach season is already over. It reminds me that the simplest methods are often the ones that last the longest, because they work with nature instead of against it. If you try even one or two of these old habits this season, I believe you will notice the difference for yourself. Your harvest may last longer than you expected. Your plants may stay healthier with less effort. You may even discover that gardening becomes more relaxing because you stop chasing quick fixes and start building steady results instead. That is one of the greatest lessons my older gardening friends ever passed on to me, and I am grateful every summer that I listened. Thank you for spending this time with me today, and I truly hope these simple ideas help you enjoy more fresh spinach from your own garden. There are many more forgotten methods that deserve to be remembered because they still work just as well today as they did many years ago. In the next video, I want to show you another simple technique that helps leafy vegetables keep producing longer while saving both time and money, and I think you may be surprised by how easy it really is.